When my husband of 5 years told me over the phone, "Your parents, your problem," I immediately stopped paying the $3,800 his family secretly needed every single month to survive. They mocked my sick father, right until their own luxury rent came due, and my mother-in-law was reduced to grabbing my arm in a parking lot, trembling as she whispered, "Please don't tell him why." Before I tell you exactly how I exposed their massive web of lies at my mother-in-law's 60th birthday party and handed my husband a folder that destroyed his entire world, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with stories about justice. Also drop a comment below and let me know, where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? I love connecting with you all. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room shrieked open, letting in a gust of freezing Chicago wind that bit right through my coat. I am Clara, 31 years old, a senior tax accountant who spends her life organizing numbers, balancing ledgers, and predicting outcomes. But absolutely nothing in my spreadsheets or financial forecasts could have prepared me for the sight of my father lying on a hospital stretcher in the trauma bay, his face ashen and the entire right side of his body completely unresponsive. He had suffered a massive stroke just 2 hours earlier. My dad is a retired postal worker. For 35 years, he walked his delivery route through blinding snowstorms, torrential spring rains, and blistering summer heat. He sorted mail with aching hands and saved every spare dime he ever made so I could go to a good college and have a better life than he did. My mother, a former diner waitress, worked on her feet until her joints swelled coming home smelling of stale coffee and fried food, just to make sure we always had a hot dinner on the table. They were the most honest, hardworking people I knew, and seeing my father reduced to a fragile, frightened patient hooked up to blaring monitors shattered my heart. The attending neurologist had just pulled me out into the chaotic, brightly lit hallway. He told me that my father had survived the initial bleeding, but to have any hope of regaining his speech and mobility, he needed immediate intensive inpatient rehabilitation. Medicare would cover a portion of the acute hospital stay, but the specialized neurological rehab facility. They recommended the only one with an open bed that could actually give my dad his life back required a massive out-of-pocket deposit up front. I stood in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, clutching a plastic clipboard to my chest like a shield. The number printed at the bottom of the facility admission form was $15,000. $15,000 needed by tomorrow morning to secure his transfer. My mother was sitting inside his curtained room, holding his limp, calloused hand, crying softly into a crumpled tissue. She did not have that kind of money. My parents lived on a fixed pension. They had modest savings enough to fix a broken roof or replace a dying water heater, but nowhere near enough to hand over a massive lump sum overnight to the American healthcare system. But I had the money, or at least I thought I did. My husband Liam and I had been married for 5 years. Liam is 34, a mid-level manager at a regional logistics firm. To the outside world, we lived a perfectly comfortable, successful middle-class life in the suburbs. From the day we returned from our honeymoon, Liam insisted that we keep our daily checking accounts separate, but maintain a joint house fund for major emergencies and our future down payment. Liam managed the joint account because he claimed his logistics background made him better at tracking investment yields and moving assets. I trusted him implicitly. I loved him. And because I was bringing in a senior accountant's salary that was nearly triple his income, I was depositing the absolute lion's share into that account every single month. I knew for a fact there was well over $110,000 sitting in that high-yield savings account. $15,000 was a mere fraction of what I had personally contributed over the last 5 years. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock the screen of my smartphone. I leaned my shoulder against the cold cinder-block wall of the hallway, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady myself before dialing Liam's number. The hospital air smelled intensely of industrial bleach and old coffee. I closed my eyes, listening to the phone ring, desperately needing the comfort of my husband's voice. I needed my partner. I needed the man who stood at the altar and promised to be my rock in good times and bad. Liam answered on the 4th ring. The background noise on the line sounded like a television blaring a loud sports game. "Liam," I said, my voice cracking on the first syllable. It's my dad. He had a severe stroke. Mom and I are at the hospital right now. There was a brief pause on the line. I waited for the panic in his voice, the immediate rush of concern, the panicked offer to drive straight over and be by my side. Instead, Liam let out a short, exasperated sigh. A stroke? Is he going to be okay? I am right in the middle of watching the playoffs. I swallowed hard, pushing down a sudden sharp spike of disbelief. They think he will survive the night, Liam, but it is really bad. He cannot move his right arm or leg. He cannot speak properly. The doctors say he needs to be transferred to a specialized neurological rehab facility immediately if he is going to have any chance of recovering his motor functions. Okay, Liam said slowly. His tone was strangely guarded, completely lacking the warmth I desperately needed. So what does the hospital want us to do about it? They need a deposit for the rehab facility, I explained, gripping the clipboard so tightly, my fingernails dug into the plastic. Medicare will not cover the full cost of the specialized daily care. The out-of-pocket deposit is $15,000. My mom doesn't have it. I need to pull the money from our joint house fund right now to secure his spot for tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not a silence of shock or sympathy. It was a calculating, heavy, deliberate silence. I could hear the television announcer cheering loudly in the background of our comfortable living room. Liam, I prompted, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. Please, I will figure out a way to pay the account back over the next few months with my corporate bonuses. I just need to initiate the transfer tonight. When Liam finally spoke, his voice was smooth cold and completely detached. It was the exact voice he used when denying a vendor contract at his logistics firm. Clara, no. We are not doing that. I froze. The chill of the hospital wall seemed to seep right through my sweater and into my bones. What do you mean, no, Liam, it is for my dad. He could be permanently paralyzed. And that is tragic, Clara, Liam replied without a single ounce of humanity in his tone. But that money is for our future. That is our house fund. I am not draining our hard-earned savings to pay off your working-class parents' medical debts. They should have planned better for their retirement. My brain struggled to process the words coming through the speaker. This was the man who had sat at my parents' dining table for years, eating the pot roast my mother cooked for him, laughing at my father's old postal service stories. Planned better, I repeated, my voice rising slightly, echoing down the sterile hallway. Liam, nobody plans for a massive stroke. I put over $90,000 of my own salary into that joint account. I am asking to use a tiny fraction of my own contributions to save my father's life. It is joint money now, Liam said stubbornly, his voice hardening with irritation. And as your husband, I say no. We are not sacrificing our financial security because your parents failed to secure theirs. I told you years ago that your family's lack of financial literacy would eventually become a burden. I will not let their poor choices drag us down. He is my father, Liam. He walked through blizzards to pay for my college tuition so I wouldn't have student loans. I cannot just let him lie here and lose his chance at a normal life. Then take out a personal loan. Liam snapped, his patience clearly exhausted by my pleading. Or put it on a high-interest credit card. But you are not touching our savings. I am putting my foot down, Clara. Your parents, your problem. You figure it out. Do not touch our savings. He hung up, just like that. A sharp click followed by the empty, hollow dial tone. I stood completely paralyzed in the bustling emergency room corridor. Doctors and nurses rushed past me, pushing medical carts and calling out charting terms, but all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. Your parents, your problem. The absolute cruelty of it knocked the wind out of me. My husband, the man I loved, was perfectly fine letting my father suffer permanent brain damage to protect a bank account that I had practically built by myself. Panic began to rise in my chest, hot and suffocating. The hospital admissions office needed the payment confirmation by tomorrow morning. I could not go back into that tiny curtained room, look at my mother's devastated, tear-stained face, and tell her that her husband was not going to get the medical care he desperately needed, because my husband wanted to protect his house fund. With trembling, uncoordinated fingers, I opened the banking application on my phone. Liam had coldly suggested I take out a personal loan. I navigated to the lending section of the app, my eyes blurred with hot, angry tears, trying to see what kind of immediate credit line I could get approved for at this hour of the night. But as the main dashboard loaded on my screen, my thumb slipped. Instead of opening the loan options, I accidentally opened the Scheduled Automated Transactions tab. The screen refreshed, displaying a neat list of our upcoming automated payments. My eyes scanned the glowing screen, and then they stopped dead. They locked onto a single recurring line item scheduled to process in exactly 3 days on the 1st of the month. Outgoing transfer, $3,800. Payee Brenda, my mother-in-law. The irony hit me so hard it felt like a physical punch to the stomach. A wave of profound, nauseating betrayal washed over me, burning away the panic and replacing it with something entirely different. $3,800. Every single month. Liam had just refused to let me use my own money to save my father's life, claiming we desperately needed to protect our financial future. He had sneered at my parents for being working class and failing to plan. He had accused my family of being a financial burden. Yet there it was glaring at me from the bright screen of my phone. The secret financial lifeline I had been funding for 4 years. The massive chunk of my salary I was sending to his mother Brenda to cover the luxury downtown apartment she absolutely could not afford, and to pay for the designer SUV his entitled sister Savannah drove around town like she was royalty. 4 years ago, Brenda had come to me sobbing, secretly drowning in credit card debt. She begged me to help her, pleading with me to keep it a secret to protect Liam's fragile pride. And because I believed in family, I had quietly used my senior accountant's salary to fund their fake aristocratic lifestyle. My husband had just told me that my father's life was not worth $15,000 of our joint money. But his family's luxurious delusions were somehow worth nearly $50,000 of my hard-earned salary every single year. I stared at the pending transfer. The tears in my eyes dried up instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp, calculating clarity. Liam was right about one thing. I was a senior tax accountant. I knew exactly how to figure it out. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room shrieked open, letting in a gust of freezing Chicago wind that bit right through my coat. I am Clara, 31 years old, a senior tax accountant who spends her life organizing numbers, balancing ledgers, and predicting outcomes. But absolutely nothing in my spreadsheets or financial forecasts could have prepared me for the sight of my father lying on a hospital stretcher in the trauma bay, his face ashen and the entire right side of his body completely unresponsive. He had suffered a massive stroke just 2 hours earlier. My dad is a retired postal worker. For 35 years, he walked his delivery route through blinding snowstorms, torrential spring rains, and blistering summer heat. He sorted mail with aching hands and saved every spare dime he ever made, so I could go to a good college and have a better life than he did. My mother, a former diner waitress, worked on her feet until her joints swelled, coming home smelling of stale coffee and fried food, just to make sure we always had a hot dinner on the table. They were the most honest, hardworking people I knew, and seeing my father reduced to a fragile, frightened patient, hooked up to blaring monitors, shattered my heart. The attending neurologist had just pulled me out into the chaotic, brightly lit hallway. He told me that my father had survived the initial bleeding, but to have any hope of regaining his speech and mobility, he needed immediate intensive inpatient rehabilitation. Medicare would cover a portion of the acute hospital stay, but the specialized neurological rehab facility. They recommended the only one with an open bed that could actually give my dad his life back required a massive out-of-pocket deposit up front. I stood in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, clutching a plastic clipboard to my chest like a shield. The number printed at the bottom of the facility admission form was $15,000. $15,000 needed by tomorrow morning to secure his transfer. My mother was sitting inside his curtained room, holding his limp, calloused hand, crying softly into a crumpled tissue. She did not have that kind of money. My parents lived on a fixed pension. They had modest savings enough to fix a broken roof or replace a dying water heater, but nowhere near enough to hand over a massive lump sum overnight to the American healthcare system. But I had the money, or at least I thought I did. My husband Liam and I had been married for 5 years. Liam is 34, a mid-level manager at a regional logistics firm. To the outside world, we lived a perfectly comfortable, successful, middle-class life in the suburbs. From the day we returned from our honeymoon, Liam insisted that we keep our daily checking accounts separate, but maintain a joint house fund for major emergencies and our future down payment. Liam managed the joint account because he claimed his logistics background made him better at tracking investment yields and moving assets. I trusted him implicitly. I loved him. And because I was bringing in a senior accountant salary that was nearly triple his income, I was depositing the absolute lion's share into that account every single month. I knew for a fact there was well over $110,000 sitting in that high-yield savings account. $15,000 was a mere fraction of what I had personally contributed over the last 5 years. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock the screen of my smartphone. I leaned my shoulder against the cold cinder-block wall of the hallway, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady myself before dialing Liam's number. The hospital air smelled intensely of industrial bleach and old coffee. I closed my eyes, listening to the phone ring, desperately needing the comfort of my husband's voice. I needed my partner. I needed the man who stood at the altar and promised to be my rock in good times and bad. Liam answered on the 4th ring. The background noise on the line sounded like a television blaring a loud sports game. Liam, I said, my voice cracking on the first syllable. It is my dad. He had a severe stroke. Mom and I are at the hospital right now. There was a brief pause on the line. I waited for the panic in his voice, the immediate rush of concern, the panicked offer to drive straight over and be by my side. Instead, Liam let out a short, exasperated sigh. A stroke? Is he going to be okay? I am right in the middle of watching the playoffs. I swallowed hard, pushing down a sudden sharp spike of disbelief. They think he will survive the night, Liam, but it is really bad. He cannot move his right arm or leg. He cannot speak properly. The doctors say he needs to be transferred to a specialized neurological rehab facility immediately if he is going to have any chance of recovering his motor functions. Okay, Liam said slowly. His tone was strangely guarded, completely lacking the warmth I desperately needed. So what does the hospital want us to do about it? They need a deposit for the rehab facility, I explained, gripping the clipboard so tightly my fingernails dug into the plastic. Medicare will not cover the full cost of the specialized daily care. The out-of-pocket deposit is $15,000. My mom does not have it. I need to pull the money from our joint house fund right now to secure his spot for tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not a silence of shock or sympathy. It was a calculating, heavy, deliberate silence. I could hear the television announcer cheering loudly in the background of our comfortable living room. Liam, I prompted, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. Please, I will figure out a way to pay the account back over the next few months with my corporate bonuses. I just need to initiate the transfer tonight. When Liam finally spoke, his voice was smooth, cold, and completely detached. It was the exact voice he used when denying a vendor contract at his logistics firm. Clara, no. We are not doing that. I froze. The chill of the hospital wall seemed to seep right through my sweater and into my bones. What do you mean, no, Liam, it is for my dad? He could be permanently paralyzed. And that is tragic, Clara, Liam replied without a single ounce of humanity in his tone. But that money is for our future. That is our house fund. I am not draining our hard-earned savings to pay off your working-class parents' medical debts. They should have planned better for their retirement. My brain struggled to process the words coming through the speaker. This was the man who had sat at my parents' dining table for years eating the pot roast my mother cooked for him, laughing at my father's old postal service stories. Planned better? I repeated, my voice rising, slightly echoing down the sterile hallway. Liam, nobody plans for a massive stroke. I put over $90,000 of my own salary into that joint account. I am asking to use a tiny fraction of my own contributions to save my father's life. It is joint money now, Liam said stubbornly, his voice hardening with irritation. And as your husband, I say no. We are not sacrificing our financial security because your parents failed to secure theirs. I told you years ago that your family's lack of financial literacy would eventually become a burden. I will not let their poor choices drag us down. He is my father, Liam. He walked through blizzards to pay for my college tuition, so I would not have student loans. I cannot just let him lie here and lose his chance at a normal life. Then take out a personal loan. Liam snapped, his patience clearly exhausted by my pleading. Or put it on a high-interest credit card. But you are not touching our savings. I am putting my foot down, Clara. Your parents, your problem. You figure it out. Do not touch our savings. He hung up. Just like that. A sharp click followed by the empty hollow dial tone. I stood completely paralyzed in the bustling emergency room corridor. Doctors and nurses rushed past me, pushing medical carts and calling out charting terms, but all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. Your parents, your problem. The absolute cruelty of it knocked the wind out of me. My husband, the man I loved, was perfectly fine, letting my father suffer permanent brain damage to protect a bank account that I had practically built by myself. Panic began to rise in my chest, hot and suffocating. The hospital admissions office needed the payment confirmation by tomorrow morning. I could not go back into that tiny curtained room, look at my mother's devastated, tear-stained face, and tell her that her husband was not going to get the medical care he desperately needed because my husband wanted to protect his house fund. With trembling, uncoordinated fingers, I opened the banking application on my phone. Liam had coldly suggested I take out a personal loan. I navigated to the lending section of the app, my eyes blurred with hot, angry tears, trying to see what kind of immediate credit line I could get approved for at this hour of the night. But as the main dashboard loaded on my screen, my thumb slipped. Instead of opening the loan options, I accidentally opened the Scheduled Automated Transactions tab. The screen refreshed, displaying a neat list of our upcoming automated payments. My eyes scanned the glowing screen, and then they stopped dead. They locked onto a single recurring line item scheduled to process in exactly 3 days on the 1st of the month. Outgoing transfer, $3,800. Payee Brenda, my mother-in-law. The irony hit me so hard it felt like a physical punch to the stomach. A wave of profound, nauseating betrayal washed over me, burning away the panic and replacing it with something entirely different. $3,800. Every single month. Liam had just refused to let me use my own money to save my father's life, claiming we desperately needed to protect our financial future. He had sneered at my parents for being working class and failing to plan. He had accused my family of being a financial burden. Yet there it was, glaring at me from the bright screen of my phone. The secret financial lifeline I had been funding for 4 years. The massive chunk of my salary I was sending to his mother Brenda to cover the luxury downtown apartment she absolutely could not afford, and to pay for the designer SUV his entitled sister Savannah drove around town like she was royalty. 4 years ago, Brenda had come to me sobbing, secretly drowning in credit card debt. She begged me to help her, pleading with me to keep it a secret to protect Liam's fragile pride. And because I believed in family, I had quietly used my senior accountant's salary to fund their fake aristocratic lifestyle. My husband had just told me that my father's life was not worth $15,000 of our joint money, but his family's luxurious delusions were somehow worth nearly $50,000 of my hard-earned salary every single year. I stared at the pending transfer. The tears in my eyes dried up, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, calculating clarity. Liam was right about one thing. I was a senior tax accountant. I knew exactly how to figure it out. The transition from the intensive care unit to the manicured grounds of the Oak Ridge Country Club felt like stepping onto another planet. My father was lying in a hospital bed with tubes taped to his arms, fighting for a chance to ever walk or speak again. My mother was sitting in a stiff plastic chair beside him, her hands folded in her lap, praying silently to a God she hoped was listening. Meanwhile, I was navigating my 10-year-old sedan down a winding driveway lined with imported Italian cypress trees and pristine flower beds. I should never have left the hospital. I should have stayed right by my parents' side. But Liam had texted me an hour earlier, his tone impatient and completely devoid of any concern for my family. He told me that his mother desperately needed her tax documents for a finance committee meeting at her club, and since I had prepared them, it was my responsibility to deliver them. I was running on zero sleep, completely traumatized by the events of the past 12 hours and moving on pure numb autopilot. My husband had given me an order, and the dutiful wife inside me, the woman who had spent 5 years trying to hold this fractured marriage together, simply obeyed. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the clubhouse. The valet, a young man in a crisp white uniform, took one look at my scuffed bumper and faded paint job, and his professional smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. I handed him my keys without a word. I did not care about his judgment. I did not care about the rows of Mercedes and Lexuses parked perfectly in the VIP spaces. All I cared about was handing over the thick manila folder tucked under my arm so I could get back to the neurological ward where real life was happening. The inside of the Oak Ridge Country Club was a masterclass in quiet, intimidating wealth. The floors were polished marble that gleamed like glass. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, expensive glow over the antique mahogany furniture. The air smelled of fresh lilies, expensive leather, and subtle high-end perfumes. It was an environment designed to make working-class people feel small, to remind anyone who did not belong that they were merely trespassing in a world they could never afford. I approached the hostess stand. A woman with an impeccable blowout and a perfectly tailored blazer gave me a polite, calculating look. I asked for Brenda, explaining I was her daughter-in-law, dropping off some paperwork. The hostess smiled warmly and pointed me toward the outdoor terrace. She told me Brenda was hosting a small luncheon on the south patio overlooking the 18th hole. I walked through the opulent dining room, my rubber-soled shoes silent against the plush carpeting. My clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in waiting room chairs. My hair was tied in a messy knot. I felt completely out of place, a tired ghost wandering through a palace. As I neared the heavy glass doors leading to the patio, the sound of a grand piano playing a soft jazz melody drifted through the air. I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. The south patio was separated into private alcoves by tall, ornate wooden trellises covered in blooming pink roses. The fragrant, heavy scent of the flowers filled the breeze. I walked slowly down the stone path, scanning the tables for Brenda. I was about to turn the corner of a particularly dense trellis when I heard a burst of familiar high-pitched laughter. It was Savannah. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand hovering just inches from the edge of the wooden lattice. I could see them through the gaps in the climbing roses. Brenda and Savannah were seated at a prime corner table under a wide canvas umbrella. They were not alone. 2 other women, prominent members of the local church committee that Brenda practically ruled with an iron fist, were sitting with them. The table was covered in crystal flutes filled with mimosas, delicate tiered plates of cucumber sandwiches, and silver platters of fresh fruit. I opened my mouth to announce myself to step out from behind the roses and hand Brenda the manila folder so I could escape this suffocating display of wealth. But before I could make a sound, the conversation shifted and my own name drifted through the fragrant air. "I just do not understand how Clara can be so dramatic," Savannah said, swirling her mimosa carelessly. She leaned back in her wrought iron chair, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "Liam called me this morning looking completely exhausted. She kept him up half the night crying about her dad." One of the church ladies, a woman named Susan, let out a sympathetic sigh. "Well, to be fair, a stroke is a very serious medical event, Savannah. I am sure she's just terrified for her father." Savannah rolled her eyes, taking a delicate sip of her drink. "It is tragic, but that is what happens when working-class people do not save. They live paycheck to paycheck, their whole lives never invest, never plan for the future, and then when a crisis hits, they expect everyone else to panic with them. Clara is stressing Liam out with this hospital drama, and it is completely unfair to my brother." My breath caught in my throat. My lungs suddenly felt like they were packed with wet cement. I stood paralyzed behind the wall of roses, my fingers gripping the manila folder so tightly the heavy paper began to crumple. Working class people. That was how my sister-in-law viewed the man who had worked manual labor for 3.5 decades to ensure his family never went hungry. She sat there in a silk blouse that cost more than my parents' weekly grocery budget drinking imported champagne, and dared to judge my father for suffering a catastrophic medical emergency. I waited for Brenda to intervene. I waited for my mother-in-law, the woman who called me her saving grace just 4 years ago, to correct her daughter. I waited for her to show a shred of basic human decency or Christian charity in front of her church friends. Instead, Brenda let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. She reached forward and picked up a fresh strawberry from the silver platter. "Thank God Liam put his foot down," Brenda said, her voice dripping with absolute elitist disdain. Can you imagine the disaster if he had yielded to her hysterics? It is a blessing he is smart enough not to drain his money into her family's poverty. The other church lady nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring something about the importance of protecting marital assets. Brenda continued, completely unbothered by the cruelty of her own words. "Liam has worked far too hard to build a respectable life for himself. He cannot be expected to drag his future down just because Clara's parents failed to secure theirs. I told him this morning, I said, Liam, you are the head of your household. You must protect your investments. You cannot allow her emotional instability to bankrupt you." Every single syllable hitting my ears felt like a physical blow, followed immediately by a wave of pure blistering realization. I stopped breathing. The world around me seemed to warp and bend, the sounds of the country club fading into a dull, rushing roar. I looked through the gaps in the green leaves and pink petals, staring at Brenda's perfectly manicured hands, at Savannah's expensive leather handbag resting on an empty chair. My mind flashed back to the automated transfer on my banking app. $3,800. I was paying for the mimosa. Savannah was drinking right now. I was paying for the designer sunglasses resting on her face. I was paying the monthly lease on the luxury vehicle she had driven to this club. I was paying the exorbitant monthly rent for the high-rise downtown apartment where Brenda slept every night. I was paying the very membership dues that allowed them to sit at this table and mock the poverty of the man currently fighting for his life on a ventilator. For 4 grueling years, I had quietly siphoned my own massive salary into their accounts to maintain their aristocratic illusion. I had lived frugally, sacrificing my own comforts, driving a beaten-up sedan, working late into the night during tax season, all so Brenda could pretend she was old money. I did it because I loved Liam. I did it because I thought we were a family. I did it because Brenda had wept real tears in my living room, begging me to protect her dignity. And here she was praising her son for protecting his money from my family, when his money was barely enough to cover his own personal expenses. Here she was elevating her son's financial genius, knowing full well that I was the sole pillar keeping her entire fraudulent life from collapsing into bankruptcy. The profound, crushing sadness that had weighed me down since my father collapsed suddenly vanished. It evaporated into the warm afternoon air, burned away by something entirely new. It was replaced by a cold, calculating, absolute rage. It was a pure, crystalline fury that sharpened every nerve ending in my body. I did not feel like crying anymore. I did not feel like the exhausted, obedient wife begging for scraps of empathy from a husband who despised my roots. I felt like a senior financial analyst who had just uncovered the most egregious, unforgivable fraud of her entire career. They thought they were untouchable. They thought Liam was their shield, the strong, dominant man holding the purse strings, keeping the greedy, working-class wife in line. They had absolutely no idea that the foundation of their entire existence rested entirely in the palm of my hand. And they had no idea how quickly I could crush it into dust. I looked at the thick manila folder in my hands. It contained Brenda's tax returns. It contained the meticulous, careful work I had done for free to ensure the IRS did not look too closely at her disastrous financial habits. Liam had demanded I bring it here to serve his mother. I did not step around the trellis. I did not storm the table and scream at them for their hypocrisy. The old Clara might have done that. The Clara who believed that communication could fix broken people. The Clara who thought that if she just explained how much they hurt her, they would apologize and change. But that Clara died the moment Brenda praised Liam for withholding $15,000 from a dying man. I took one step backward, completely silent on the stone pathway. There was a large polished brass trash receptacle standing next to the patio entrance, designed to blend in seamlessly with the upscale decor. I walked over to it. I looked down into the dark opening. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I dropped the manila folder into the garbage. It hit the bottom with a satisfying heavy thud, burying Brenda's precious tax documents beneath discarded cocktail napkins and empty water bottles. I turned my back on the sunlit patio, on the climbing roses, and on the women laughing over their champagne. I walked back through the plush, quiet dining room past the hostess who gave me a confused look and out through the grand glass doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The valet brought my scuffed 10-year-old sedan to the front. I tipped him $5, got into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself inside the quiet sanctuary of my car. I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the manicured driveway. I had a lot of work to do. I had an automated transfer to cancel. I had a father to save. And I had a ruthless, systematic, bulletproof plan to construct. Liam and his family wanted to draw a line between their wealth and my working-class problems. They wanted to protect their assets. I started the engine, putting the car into gear. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to cut the cord, pull the rug out from under their luxury lives, and watch their entire fake empire collapse into nothing. And I was going to do it all with the cold, unforgiving precision of a ledger balancing to zero. I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan with the engine idling. The plush green lawns and pristine flower beds of the Oak Ridge Country Club stretched out beyond my windshield, but I did not see them. My vision was entirely tunneled on the glowing screen of my smartphone resting in the palm of my hand. The heavy, fragrant scent of blooming roses seemed to cling to my clothes, a sickening reminder of the women sitting on the patio sipping champagne and laughing at my dying father. I took one long, slow breath to steady my trembling fingers. The profound, suffocating sadness that had weighed me down since the hospital had completely evaporated. It was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury that sharpened every nerve ending in my body. I opened my banking application. The interface loaded with a cheerful blue greeting, a stark contrast to the absolute hostility surging through my veins. I bypassed the checking and savings dashboards and navigated directly to the automated scheduled transactions menu. A neat, organized list of my financial obligations populated the screen. I scrolled past the utility bills, past the auto insurance, past the mortgage payments. My finger stopped when I reached the bottom of the list. The name Brenda stared back at me in bold black letters. Next to it was the designated amount, $3,800. The transaction was set to automatically clear in exactly 3 days, right on the 1st of the month. I sat there and let the sheer horrific math of that number wash over me. $3,800 a month. 48 months. That was $182,400. I had quietly, dutifully siphoned nearly $200,000 of my own hard-earned salary into the accounts of people who viewed my family as pathetic, working-class trash. I had worn off the rat clothing and skipped my own vacations to ensure Brenda could maintain her luxury high-rise apartment and Savannah could drive a leased designer vehicle. I had bought their entire aristocratic illusion with my sweat, all to protect the pride of a husband who just told me to let my father suffer to protect his own bank account. I tapped the transaction. A secondary menu popped up offering options to edit the amount, change the date, or delete the series. I pressed delete. A warning prompt appeared on the screen asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to permanently cancel this recurring transfer. I pressed confirm. The screen refreshed. The transaction was gone. Just like that, the digital guillotine dropped. With a single tap of my thumb, I completely severed the financial artery that kept my mother-in-law's fake, glamorous lifestyle breathing. But I was not finished. My father was still lying in a trauma bay waiting for a miracle, and I finally had the resources to give him one. I opened the wire transfer portal within the banking application. I entered the specific routing and account numbers for the specialized neurological rehabilitation center the doctor had recommended. In the payment amount field, I typed in the exact sum I had just clawed back from Brenda. $3,800. It was not the full $15,000 required for the deposit, but it was a massive first installment. It was more than enough to prove to the facility administrators that the funds were available and to secure his specialized bed for tomorrow morning. I quickly navigated to my separate investment portfolio and liquidated a portion of my private stock dividends to easily cover the remaining balance. When the green check mark finally appeared on my screen, confirming the medical payment was successful and actively processing, a massive physical weight lifted entirely off my chest. My father was going to get the intensive physical therapy he desperately needed. He was going to have a fighting chance to walk again. He was going to have a chance to speak again. He was safe. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I put the car in gear and drove away from the country club without looking back. I did not go home to my husband. Instead, I drove straight toward downtown Chicago, pulling into the underground parking garage of the commercial high-rise where my accounting firm was located. The building was completely deserted at this hour of the evening. The lobby was quiet, illuminated only by dim security lights. The night guard gave me a confused nod as I swiped my identification badge at the turnstile. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor and walked down the silent hallway to my corner office. I turned on the bright overhead fluorescent lights and dropped my keys onto the mahogany desk. I took off my coat and sat down in my ergonomic leather chair. I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was no longer a compliant, betrayed wife trying to keep the peace. I was a senior financial analyst, and I was about to conduct the most ruthless, meticulous, hostile audit of my entire professional career. I booted up my dual desktop monitors. I logged into my secured personal and joint financial archives. I opened a blank, sprawling spreadsheet across the primary screen and began to build a fortress of absolute, undeniable proof. I decided to start with the income disparity. Liam loved to play the role of the traditional dominant provider. He paraded around our social circles acting like the head of the household who managed our joint house fund because his corporate logistics background supposedly made him superior at handling large assets. I accessed the digital vault containing our tax returns. I pulled Liam's documents for the last 5 consecutive years. His annual take-home pay had peaked at exactly $62,000. He had not received a promotion or a significant raise since the day we got married. Then I pulled my own documentation. My annual take-home pay after taxes and corporate bonuses was $185,000. I was making exactly 3 times his salary. I printed both sets of forms, listening to the heavy office printer hum to life in the corner. I placed the warm pages in a neat, organized pile on my desk. Next, I mapped out our actual household expenses. For half a decade, I had faithfully deposited the vast majority of my paycheck into that joint savings account, completely trusting his management. At the same time, I was the one covering our monthly mortgage payments, our utility bills, our groceries, and every single vacation we ever took. The joint account that Liam had viciously refused to let me touch to save my father currently held a balance of $110,000. I pulled the raw bank data and ran a simple tracking macro to trace the origin of every single deposit. The formula calculated the results in less than 2 seconds. Exactly $98,000 of that total balance had come directly from my personal checking account transfers. Liam had contributed barely $12,000 over 5 years. He was aggressively hoarding my wealth, contributing virtually nothing to our actual survival, and claiming my money as his own personal achievement. I printed the detailed deposit logs and added them to the growing pile of evidence. Then came the most damning section of all. I logged into my personal email archive and searched for Brenda's name. I sorted the results chronologically and scrolled all the way back 4 years to the exact week she had come to my suburban house crying on my sofa. The emails were right there, preserved perfectly in the digital cloud, waiting to see the light of day. I opened the first message. In her own words, Brenda wrote that she had completely maxed out 6 different high-interest credit cards. She confessed she was facing immediate eviction from her luxury downtown apartment because she was 3 months behind on rent. She begged me for financial salvation. I opened the second email in the chain. She pleaded with me to keep the entire arrangement an absolute secret from Liam. She explicitly wrote that it would break his fragile heart and destroy his manly pride to know his mother was a complete financial failure. I printed every single email. I printed every electronic transfer receipt from the last 48 months. I printed the concrete proof that I was the one paying for Savannah's designer SUV lease. I printed the payment confirmations for the country club membership fees they used to sit around drinking mimosas while mocking my family's working-class background. I took the massive stack of papers down the hall to the main copy room. I used the heavy-duty professional binding machine to create thick, perfectly organized dossiers. I even included a color-coded pie chart at the very front of each packet. It was a touch of dark accountant humor, a visual graphic clearly showing the absurd percentage of my income that funded their entire luxurious existence, compared to Liam's meager contributions. The bound dossiers felt incredibly heavy in my hands. They were absolute bulletproof weapons of truth. There was absolutely no way Liam or his mother could argue with cold, hard, verifiable numbers. It was past midnight when I finally packed the finished dossiers into my leather tote bag. I turned off the office lights, rode the elevator down to the empty parking garage, and drove back to our house in the suburbs. The porch light was glowing against the dark sky. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. The house smelled like stale beer and takeout food. Liam was sitting on the living room sofa exactly where I had left him hours ago. The television was still blaring a sports analysis program. Empty bottles were gathered on the glass coffee table. He did not get up to greet me. He simply looked over his shoulder as I took off my coat and hung it in the hallway closet. "Did you drop off the folder to my mother?" he asked. His tone was still laced with that same arrogant, commanding condescension he had used during our phone call. He did not ask about my father. He did not ask if my mother was okay. "Yes," I said smoothly. My voice was perfectly flat and controlled. "I took care of it." "Good," he said, turning his attention back to the television screen. "I hope you have calmed down since this afternoon, Clara. I know you are feeling emotional about your dad right now, but you have to understand that I am making the tough decisions for our future. We cannot let your family's poor financial planning drain our hard-earned assets. You will thank me for this later when we buy our dream house." I stood in the entryway and looked at the man sitting on my couch. He was so completely certain of his own dominance. He truly believed he was the master of our financial universe, the logical leader steering his hysterical wife away from a terrible mistake. He had absolutely no idea that I had just unilaterally dismantled his mother's entire life and mathematically proved his own insignificance in a single evening. "I am sure I will, Liam," I replied quietly. I walked past him and went upstairs to our master bedroom. I placed my heavy leather tote bag safely inside the back of my closet and shut the wooden door. I did not shed another tear for my marriage. I did not feel any anxiety or doubt about what I was going to do. I just felt a profound, chilling patience settling deep into my bones. Today was the 28th of the month. I changed into my pajamas, climbed into bed, pulled the heavy covers over my shoulders and closed my eyes. I just had to wait for the first of the month to arrive. The first of the month arrived with a heavy gray sky and a steady freezing drizzle that washed over the streets of Chicago. For most people, the first of the month is just another day on the calendar, a routine marker for paying bills and sorting out the weekly budget. But for me, it was the exact moment the digital guillotine I had set up was scheduled to finally drop. I sat at my mahogany desk on the 14th floor of my firm. The corporate accounting world hummed around me. Keyboards clattered, desk phones rang, and junior analysts hurried past the glass walls of my office holding thick stacks of quarterly reports. I had my dual monitors glowing brightly in front of me, but my eyes were not focused on the corporate tax spreadsheets I was supposed to be reviewing. Instead, I was staring intently at the secure banking application open on my smartphone, which sat right beside my coffee mug. At exactly 9 in the morning, the confirmation notification appeared on my screen. The wire transfer to my father's specialized neurological rehabilitation center had successfully cleared. The funds were completely secured. He was going to get his bed. He was safe. I closed my eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time since the terrifying screech of the emergency room doors days ago, my chest did not feel like it was being crushed in an invisible vice. The massive burden of saving my father's life had been paid for by the exact dollars I had forcefully clawed back from the people who had mocked his suffering. But as profoundly relieving as that moment was, it was only half of the equation. The other half was about to hit Brenda and Savannah like a runaway freight train. I poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and settled back into my ergonomic leather chair. I knew exactly how their mornings operated. Savannah usually slept until 10, then headed straight to her exclusive downtown salon for her bi-weekly hair treatments. Brenda would be finishing her morning Pilates class at the country club before heading back to her luxury high-rise apartment to meet her wealthy friends for lunch. They lived in a beautiful, insulated bubble of endless consumption, a glamorous bubble entirely inflated by my paycheck. At 11:14 in the morning, the bubble popped. My phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk. I glanced down. The screen illuminated with a text message from Savannah. I did not pick it up immediately. I let it vibrate a second time, then a third. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, bitter taste before finally unlocking the device. The messages were frantic, typed with the messy urgency of someone who had never been told no in her entire adult life. "Clara, call your stupid bank right now. I am at the salon and my card keeps declining. It is so embarrassing. The receptionist is literally staring at me while I try to find another card to use. Tell them to lift the fraud alert immediately. I need this paid." I read the words twice, letting the sheer blinding entitlement wash over me. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask if my father had survived his critical time in the intensive care unit. She did not even consider the possibility that I had intentionally cut her off. In Savannah's mind, my money was her money, and the only logical explanation for her card declining was a technical glitch that the hired help needed to fix right away so she could get back to her pampering. I placed the phone back on the desk without typing a single letter in response. Let her sit there in the plush leather chair of the salon, surrounded by women with real money, while the front desk manager demanded a payment she could no longer provide. 10 minutes later, the screen lit up again. This time, the incoming call banner displayed Brenda's name. I watched it ring. The phone vibrated across the desk, a desperate buzzing plea for attention. I let it ring until it rolled over to voicemail. Less than 30 seconds later, a barrage of text messages flooded my notification center, popping up one after another in rapid succession. "Clara, pick up your phone right now. The property manager for my building just sent me a very rude and threatening email. He claims my rent transfer was rejected for insufficient funds. This is completely unacceptable. You need to wire the money manually today, or they are going to charge me an outrageous late fee and flag my file. Call me the absolute second you read this." I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window at the rain-slicked city skyline. The absolute audacity of it was staggering. Brenda was facing eviction because the secret financial lifeline I provided had been abruptly severed, and her immediate reaction was to scold me for the inconvenience of a late fee. She truly believed I existed solely to serve her lifestyle. She believed my labor, my sweat, and my daily sacrifices belonged to her by right of marriage. I silenced my phone, flipped it face down on the desk, and spent the rest of the afternoon diving deep into my client portfolios. I reviewed deductions, balanced complex ledgers, and finalized tax strategies. I channeled all my energy into my career, the very thing that actually gave me real power and independence in this world. I felt completely grounded. I felt completely in control. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the office had mostly emptied out. The sky outside had darkened into a deep, bruised purple, and the rain was still falling in a steady, miserable sheet. I packed my laptop into my leather tote bag, slipped into my trench coat, and headed down to the underground parking garage. The garage was dimly lit and echoed heavily with the sound of my sensible heels clicking against the damp concrete. The air smelled of wet asphalt and heavy car exhaust. I was mentally preparing myself to go home and face Liam, to put on the mask of the dutiful, stressed wife and pretend everything was normal until the divorce trap I had set was fully ready to spring. I reached my 10-year-old sedan and reached into my coat pocket for my keys. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the thick concrete pillar near the elevator bank. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat, instinctively tightening my grip on my heavy leather bag. But as the figure stepped out from the darkness and under the flickering fluorescent security light, my fear instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating calm. It was Brenda. She looked absolutely nothing like the haughty, polished matriarch who had sat on the country club patio sipping champagne just a few days ago. The wealthy facade had completely crumbled. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was flattened by the damp parking garage air, frizzy and unstyled. She was wearing an expensive cashmere coat, but it was buttoned unevenly, thrown on in a sheer panic. Her designer handbag was clutched against her chest like a shield, and her eyes were wide, darting, and rimmed with smudged mascara. She had driven all the way to my corporate office and waited in the cold, damp, underground garage just to ambush me. "Clara," she gasped, hurrying across the gray concrete toward me. Her voice echoed loudly in the empty space, shrill and entirely unhinged. "Why are you ignoring my calls? I have been trying to reach you all day long." I did not back away. I stood perfectly still next to the driver's side door of my car, looking at her with the same detached, clinical expression I used when auditing a fraudulent business expense report. "I have been working, Brenda," I said smoothly. My voice did not rise. It did not shake. "What are you doing in my office parking garage?" She stopped a few feet away from me, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "The bank, Clara. Something is horribly wrong with the bank. The automatic transfer did not go through this morning. Savannah called me crying from downtown because her card was humiliatingly declined, and the property manager for my building actually slipped a notice under my door. They are threatening to start eviction proceedings if the balance is not cleared by tomorrow morning. You have to call your bank right now and fix this glitch." I looked at her. Truly. Looked at her and felt a profound sense of closure. She really had no idea. She was so blinded by her own narcissism and entitlement that she could not even conceive of a world where I simply decided to stop paying her way. "There is no glitch with the bank, Brenda," I said softly. The words cut through the damp air like a surgical blade. The automated transfers were canceled. I canceled them permanently. Brenda's jaw literally dropped. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old under the harsh garage lights. She stared at me as if I had just spoken to her in a language she could not comprehend. "Canceled," she repeated the word stumbling out of her mouth. "What do you mean, canceled? You cannot cancel them. We have an arrangement, Clara. You promised to help us. You promised to protect Liam from knowing about my debts." "I did promise to help you." I agreed, my tone dangerously quiet. 4 years ago, when you came to me crying and claiming you were desperate, I gave you my word. And for 48 months, I gave you $3,800 of my own hard-earned salary every single month. I sacrificed my own peace of mind, my own financial freedom to ensure you could maintain your luxury apartment and your daughter could drive a designer car. Then why, she pleaded, taking a frantic step forward. "Why would you stop now? We will lose everything." "Because I was at the country club on Tuesday afternoon," I said. Brenda froze. The desperate, commanding energy drained out of her body, replaced instantly by absolute paralyzing terror. She stopped breathing. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "I was standing right behind the rose trellis while you and Savannah drank mimosas with your church friends." I continued, stepping closer to her, refusing to let her look away from my eyes. "I heard every single word you said. I heard Savannah mock my father for being working class. I heard her call my family a tragic burden because we did not save enough money for a catastrophic medical emergency. Brenda raised a trembling hand to her mouth. Clara, please, you misunderstood. We were just talking. It was just idle gossip. I am not finished, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that commanded the entire empty garage. I stood there and listened while you praised your son for protecting his money from my family's poverty. I listened while you called it a blessing that Liam put his foot down and refused to help my dying father. You sat there drinking champagne paid for by my labor and laughed at the man who sacrificed his entire life so I could get the education that currently funds your ridiculous fake aristocratic lifestyle. Tears began to spill over Brenda's lower lashes, tracking through her foundation. She was trembling violently now, her expensive cashmere coat shaking around her shoulders. She realized the horrifying magnitude of what she had done. The golden goose was dead, and she had personally handed me the knife. Clara. I am so sorry, she sobbed, reaching out and grabbing my forearm. Her fingers dug into my coat sleeve, desperate and clawing. I did not mean it. I was just trying to look strong in front of the committee. You know how those women are, they judge everything. I had to pretend Liam was the one providing for everyone. I had to protect our image. Please, Clara. You cannot do this to us. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. It was the hand of a woman who had never worked an honest day in her life. A woman who believed the world owed her luxury simply because she demanded it. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a frantic, trembling whisper. If the rent does not clear by tomorrow, the building management will post a public eviction notice. Savannah's car will be repossessed. If we get evicted, Liam will find out everything. He will know I am completely broke. Please, Clara. Please do not tell him why. Restore the transfer. Just this one last time. I promise we will figure something else out next month. I stared into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I thought about my mother sitting in the miserable, uncomfortable plastic chair in the intensive care unit, holding my father's paralyzed hand, terrified of how they were going to survive the next month. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the women who thought my family's pain was an entertaining topic for a luncheon. I slowly reached over and removed her hand from my arm, peeling her fingers back one by one with deliberate, unyielding force. I looked Brenda dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of the cold, dismissive arrogance her own son had used on me just a few nights ago. I let the silence stretch between us until she was absolutely squirming in the damp garage air. Your rent, I said smoothly, perfectly echoing Liam's exact cadence, is your problem. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp, stepping backward as if I had physically struck her. I turned my back on her, unlocked my car, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the roar of the old motor echoing loudly off the concrete walls. I put the car in reverse and slowly backed out of my parking space. Through the windshield, I watched Brenda standing perfectly still in the middle of the empty driving lane, clutching her designer bag, completely abandoned and entirely out of options. I shifted into drive and pulled away, heading toward the exit ramp. As I merged onto the street, I checked my rearview mirror one last time. Brenda was watching my taillights disappear. The panic and the desperate begging had vanished from her posture. She was standing up straighter now, her shoulders rigid, her face contorted into a mask of pure vicious malice. A cornered animal is incredibly dangerous. Brenda realized in that moment that she could no longer manipulate me with tears or appeals to family loyalty. The secret agreement was dead, and she was going to have to explain her bankruptcy to her precious son. But parasites do not just accept defeat and walk away quietly. They fight for survival. Looking at her reflection in the glass of the rearview mirror, I knew the war was far from over. Brenda was not going to go down without destroying everything in her path, and she was absolutely going to strike first. 48 hours. That is exactly how long it took for a terrified extortionist to transform back into a vicious social predator. Brenda had failed to manipulate me in the concrete shadows of my office parking garage. She had seen the absolute finality in my eyes when I drove away. And just as I had predicted, she did not retreat gracefully into the reality of her own bankruptcy. Instead, she mobilized her army. I was sitting at my mahogany desk on Thursday morning, carefully auditing a complex corporate tax return, when the first tremor of her smear campaign reached me. My personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed the name of Liam's Aunt Patricia. Patricia was a woman who thrived on suburban drama, treating family tragedies like a spectator sport. I took a slow breath, squared my shoulders, and answered the call with my standard polite greeting. Patricia did not even say hello. She immediately launched into a hushed, theatrical tone dripping with artificial sympathy. "Clara, honey, we are all just so incredibly worried about you. Brenda called me last night in absolute tears. She told me about your poor father having a stroke. We know the medical bills are putting you under a terrible strain, but you cannot take your trauma out on Liam and his mother." I sat perfectly still, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. I asked Patricia exactly what Brenda had told her. The lies that poured out of Patricia's mouth were nothing short of a psychological masterpiece. Brenda had not simply complained about me. She had orchestrated a comprehensive, devastating narrative designed to completely assassinate my character before I could utter a single word of the truth. According to Brenda, the shock of my father's medical emergency had caused me to suffer a complete and total mental breakdown. I was allegedly spiraling out of control, unable to process the reality of my parents' working-class poverty. But the most brilliant toxic part of her lie was the financial spin. Brenda had convinced Patricia, and presumably the rest of the extended family, that I was actively embezzling money from the joint savings account Liam had worked so hard to build. She claimed I was financially abusing my husband, secretly siphoning his wealth to fund my destitute parents, and maliciously freezing Brenda out of her own legitimate bank accounts to hide my tracks. I thanked Patricia for her concern, kept my voice completely devoid of emotion, and ended the call. I did not try to defend myself. I knew exactly how pointless it was to argue with a woman who had already bought front-row tickets to my execution. Less than an hour later, the second call came. This time, it was Susan, the head of the hospitality committee at Brenda's upscale church. Susan used the exact same condescending, pitying tone. She told me she was praying for my mental health. She suggested I seek counseling for my sudden erratic behavior. She gently advised me that stealing from my husband's future to bail out my parents' mistakes was a sin that would rot my marriage from the inside out. Within 48 hours, the gossip network had completely blanketed Liam's entire social circle. Brenda and Savannah had successfully painted me as a deranged, hysterical thief, and painted themselves as the noble, suffering victims of a woman who had lost her grip on reality. They were laying the groundwork to ensure that when the eviction notices inevitably arrived at their luxury doors, everyone would blame my supposed financial sabotage rather than their own reckless greed. I drove home from this office that evening with the radio turned completely off. The silence inside my car was heavy, but my mind was moving with the sharp, relentless precision of a ticking clock. I knew Brenda's lies were not just meant for the church ladies or the nosy aunts. The true target of her manipulation was the man waiting for me inside our house. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, the atmosphere was incredibly thick. The air felt charged, humming with the kind of toxic electricity that precedes a violent storm. I hung my trench coat in the closet and walked toward the back of the house. Liam was waiting for me in the kitchen. He was standing with his back against the granite island, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He was wearing his expensive athletic gear, holding a tumbler of water. The kitchen was beautiful, boasting custom cabinetry and high-end stainless steel appliances. I had paid for every single inch of that renovation with my annual corporate bonuses, but Liam stood there guarding the space as if he were a king defending his castle from an invading thief. His face was mottled with a furious, ugly red flush. The moment I stepped over the threshold, he unleashed his anger. "Where is my money, Clara?" he demanded. His voice was a harsh, barking shout that bounced off the tiled backsplash. I stopped in the center of the room. I did not drop my leather tote bag. I held on to it, feeling the solid weight of my work laptop inside. I looked at the man I had married 5 years ago. I looked for a trace of the partner who had promised to protect me. I looked for a shred of independent thought. There was nothing there. He was entirely hollow, an empty vessel perfectly filled to the brim with his mother's poison. I do not know what you are talking about, Liam, I said, keeping my volume completely level. Do not play games with me, he yelled, taking a heavy step toward me. My mother called me this afternoon. She was absolutely devastated. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She told me everything you have been doing behind my back. She told me about your complete mental breakdown. I tilted my head slightly. And what exactly am I doing behind your back? You are stealing from our future, Liam roared, his face twisting with righteous indignation. He pointed a shaking finger squarely at my face. You are taking the wealth I built for us and funneling it to your parents. My mother told me you locked her out of the banking portals just to hide your tracks. She told me you are desperately trying to bail out your father's medical debts by draining our joint assets. I told you specifically your parents are your problem. I explicitly ordered you not to touch our savings. The sheer blinding audacity of his words was almost hypnotic. Brenda had not just lied to him. She had mirrored reality, perfectly taking my actual actions of cutting off her luxury allowance and twisting them into a narrative of my own thievery. She knew Liam's ego was his biggest blind spot. She knew he loved to view himself as the dominant financial provider, even though the math proved he was practically a dependent. She weaponized his arrogance against me with flawless precision. I looked at his furious red face. He was not asking for my side of the story. He was not expressing concern for my father, who was currently lying in a rehabilitation facility, fighting to regain the ability to speak. Liam had completely swallowed the lie because the lie protected his worldview. The lie allowed him to feel superior. Nobody is stealing your money, Liam, I said calmly. Your money is exactly where it has always been. You are a liar, he spat, closing the distance between us. You are completely out of control, Clara. You are financially abusing me. You think just because your family is destitute, you have the right to drag me down into the gutter with them. My mother warned me about marrying into a working-class family with no financial literacy. She said you people always panic when things get hard, and now you are trying to bankrupt us to save your father. The words hung in the warm air of the kitchen, toxic and heavy. You people. That was how my husband viewed me. That was how he viewed the man who raised me. In his mind, my family's lack of country club memberships and luxury cars was a moral failure. He saw my father's stroke not as a heartbreaking tragedy, but as an inconvenience, a threat to his comfortable, subsidized suburban existence. I did not scream at him. I did not cry. I did not fall to my knees and beg him to believe me. As I stared at his sneering, furious face, something deep inside my chest finally snapped. It was not a loud break. It was a quiet, clean severing of the invisible cord that had kept me tied to this marriage for 5 years. The love I had felt for him evaporated entirely, leaving behind a cold, clinical emptiness. I was no longer looking at my husband. I was looking at a hostile liability. Liam mistook my silence for submission. He thought my lack of tears was proof of my guilt. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest, reveling in the power he believed he held over me. I am putting a stop to this right now, he declared, his voice dripping with authority. I am going to contact the bank tomorrow morning and lock you out of all the joint accounts. I am taking full unilateral control of our assets before your hysterical behavior leaves us completely ruined. He paused, letting his threat hang in the air, waiting for me to panic. When I remained perfectly still, he delivered his final demand. My mother is turning 60 this weekend, he said, his tone commanding and absolute. We are hosting a massive birthday dinner for her at the steakhouse downtown. The entire family is flying in. Her friends from the church committee will be there, and you are going to bring a full comprehensive financial statement to that dinner. You are going to stand up in front of everyone and prove to me and my family that you have not stolen a single dime of my money. You are going to account for every penny you have spent since your father went into the hospital. And if you refuse, or if the numbers do not add up perfectly, I am filing for divorce and freezing every single asset we own. He glared down at me, absolutely certain he had backed me into a corner from which I could never escape. He wanted me humiliated. He wanted me broken. He wanted me to grovel before Brenda and beg for forgiveness in front of the very women who had mocked my father's illness. He thought he was the one setting the trap. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the match, the gasoline, and the exact coordinates to burn his entire fake empire right down to the bedrock. I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I let the corners of my mouth lift into a small, terrifyingly calm smile. "Okay, Liam," I said softly, my voice completely steady. "I will bring the statements. I will show everyone exactly where all the money has been going." He scoffed, turned his back on me in disgust, and marched out of the kitchen. I stood alone in the bright, quiet room. The marriage was truly dead. There was nothing left to mourn, nothing left to save. I walked over to the kitchen island, set down my leather bag, and pulled out my daily planner. It was time to visit a divorce attorney. It was time to prepare the final blow. The morning after our confrontation broke cold and clear over the Chicago suburbs. I had spent the night in the guest bedroom lying perfectly still on the mattress, while my mind sorted through a decade of memories like a high-speed sorting machine processing corrupted files. When the sun finally began to creep through the slatted blinds, casting pale yellow stripes across the hardwood floor, I felt an incredible sense of absolute clarity. The heavy, suffocating fog of marital obligation that had kept me compliant for 5 years had completely burned away. I got out of bed, smoothed the wrinkles from my silk pajamas, and walked downstairs to brew a pot of coffee. I needed caffeine to fuel the precision required for the days ahead. The house was quiet, but the air felt brittle like glass, ready to shatter at the slightest tap. I walked into our custom-designed kitchen, a beautiful space boasting high-end stainless steel appliances and imported marble countertops. I had paid for every single inch of that renovation with my annual corporate bonuses, but the man currently sitting at the kitchen island acted as though he owned the very air I was breathing. Liam was already dressed for work. He was wearing the tailored charcoal suit I had purchased for him for our anniversary last year. He had a yellow legal pad resting in front of him, covered in aggressive, heavily indented handwriting. A half-empty glass of water sat next to his clenched fist. He did not look up when I entered the room. He deliberately kept his eyes focused on his notepad, clearly wanting to maximize the dramatic effect of his presence. He was trying to project the image of a dominant, decisive patriarch who had spent the night wrestling with heavy burdens. I simply walked past him, filled the reservoir of my expensive espresso machine, and waited for him to deliver his rehearsed speech. As the coffee began to brew, filling the kitchen with a rich roasted aroma, Liam finally broke the silence. He told me he had been up all night speaking with his mother and consulting with a close family friend who happened to work in property law. He said he had reached a final, non-negotiable decision regarding my deeply erratic and abusive behavior. I stood across from him holding my warm ceramic mug and looked at his face. I searched his features for any trace of the partner who had promised to protect me in sickness and in health. I looked for a shred of independent thought or genuine concern for the woman he called his wife. There was absolutely nothing there. He was entirely hollow, an empty vessel perfectly filled to the brim with his mother's toxic poison. Liam stood up, pushing his chair back so forcefully it scraped loudly against the pristine tile floor. He leaned his palms flat against the cool marble island, trying to physically loom over me. He announced with a voice trembling with a terrifying mix of self-righteousness and barely concealed malice that his mother Brenda was celebrating her 60th birthday this upcoming Saturday. I knew about the birthday. Brenda had been talking about it for 6 months. She had booked the private dining room at a very exclusive high-end steakhouse downtown. It was an establishment where the appetizers alone cost more than what my parents spent on groceries in a week. The guest list included over 50 people. Liam's entire extended family was flying in from out of state. Brenda had also invited the most prominent members of her church congregation, the same women who had sat on the country club patio and mocked my father's stroke. She had invited several wealthy socialites she desperately wanted to impress. It was supposed to be her crowning social event of the decade, a glamorous display of her fabricated old money status. But now Liam declared, sweeping his arm through the air, the dinner was going to serve a dual purpose. He pointed his finger directly at my chest. He demanded that I bring a comprehensive physical financial audit to that steakhouse on Saturday night. I was to stand up in front of his entire extended family, his mother's influential friends, and the church elders, and publicly present the exact status of our joint accounts. I had to prove line by agonizing line that I had not embezzled a single dime of his hard-earned money to secretly fund my destitute working-class parents. I had to exonerate myself before the very people his mother had already maliciously poisoned against me. Liam did not stop there. He leaned closer, his face flushing a mottled angry red as he delivered his ultimatum. If I refused to comply with his demand, or if I cowardly tried to skip the dinner to hide my guilt, he promised to take immediate and devastating action. He swore he would file for a highly contested divorce the very next morning. Furthermore, he threatened to secure an emergency court injunction to completely freeze all of our financial assets by Monday. He boasted that his mother's friends knew powerful judges in the city who would not hesitate to lock me out of my own bank accounts to stop a hysterical thief from draining her husband dry. He wanted me penniless, publicly humiliated, and begging for mercy on my knees. The sheer blinding audacity of his words was almost hypnotic. He was threatening to freeze the assets that I had almost entirely generated. He was threatening to publicly expose me for a financial crime I had never committed, all to protect a woman who was currently facing eviction because I stopped paying her rent. He had completely swallowed Brenda's lies, because those lies protected his worldview. The narrative that I was a desperate thief trying to bail out my poor parents allowed him to feel superior. It allowed him to maintain the illusion that he was the wealthy provider and I was the lucky charity case. Liam stared hard into my face, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He expected my eyes to fill with frantic, terrified tears. He expected me to drop my coffee mug, collapse into the nearest bar stool, and frantically plead with him to keep our finances private. He thought the sheer terror of public exposure in front of 50 wealthy, judgmental strangers would break my spirit. He assumed I would confess to crimes I never committed just to save face and avoid the social slaughter he was promising. He wanted to watch the strong, financially independent woman he married crumble into a desperate, obedient subordinate who would quickly restore his mother's monthly allowance to make the nightmare stop. But I did not cry. I did not shake. My heart rate did not even elevate. The absolute absurdity of his demand triggered a profound, crystal-clear calm deep inside my mind. It was the exact same clinical detachment I felt when I sat down to audit a particularly hostile corporate client who thought they could hide their fraudulent expenses behind aggressive bluster. Liam wanted a public audit. He was practically demanding that I bring the exact weapon I had spent all of last night binding together in the silent, sterile copy room of my accounting firm. He was meticulously building his own execution scaffold, measuring the rope tying the noose and eagerly handing me the lever to drop the floor. I looked at the man standing across the kitchen island and realized how little he actually knew about the woman he had lived with for half a decade. He saw a working-class girl who should be terrified of high society judgment. He did not see a senior tax professional who dismantled lies for a living. He did not realize that I'd already mapped out every single dollar, every hidden transfer, and every damning email in a 40-page color-coded dossier that was currently sitting safely inside my leather tote bag in the upstairs closet. I let a slow, serene smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the kind of smile a predator gives when its prey wanders willingly into a locked cage and closes the door from the inside. I took another slow sip of my coffee, relishing the rich, bitter flavor of the dark roast. I placed the mug gently on the marble counter, making sure not to make a sound. Then I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with absolute unwavering sweetness. I told Liam that I thought his idea was absolutely brilliant. I agreed enthusiastically that full transparency was exactly what this family needed right now to clear the air. I told him that secrets and hidden financial burdens were toxic to a marriage, and that bringing everything out into the light was the only way to move forward. I promised him with total sincerity that I would bring every single document, every bank statement, and every receipt to the upscale steakhouse on Saturday night. I swore I would stand up in front of his mother, his extended family, and the entire church congregation and show everyone exactly where all the money had been going for the past 4 years. Liam was momentarily taken aback by my cheerful, unhesitating compliance. The angry red flush on his face faded into a look of slight confusion. He furrowed his brow and searched my eyes for any sign of sarcasm or deceit. He was looking for the trap, but his own towering ego blinded him to the reality of the situation. Because I was not fighting back, because I was not screaming or crying, he assumed he had won. He found nothing in my expression but genuine, eager cooperation. His chest puffed out with arrogant pride. The confusion melted away, replaced by a smug, triumphant sneer. He genuinely believed he had terrified me into total submission. He thought my willingness to present the documents was a desperate attempt to throw myself at the mercy of his family court. He believed that on Saturday night I would stand up and tearfully confess to sending a few $100s to my sick father and beg Brenda and the church ladies for their Christian forgiveness. Liam gave me a curt, dismissive nod, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the counter, walked past me without a single word of affection, and marched out the front door. I stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the heavy wooden door click shut. I walked over to the front window and pulled back the sheer curtain just enough to watch him. He walked down the driveway with a confident bounce in his step. He tossed his briefcase onto the passenger seat of his car, settled behind the steering wheel, and backed out into the street. He drove off toward the city, looking incredibly smug and victorious, ready to tell his mother that the threat had worked perfectly. I let the curtain fall back into place and leaned against the cool glass of the window. He was driving away completely and entirely unaware that his brilliant public ultimatum was the exact catalyst I needed to destroy his mother's carefully constructed, aristocratic illusion forever. He thought he had cornered a frightened mouse who would do anything to avoid a scandal. He did not realize he had just invited a lion into a room full of fresh meat and handed her the microphone. I walked back to the kitchen island, picked up my coffee, and took a long, deep breath. The house felt lighter already, as if the foundations were preparing to unmoor themselves from a life built entirely on manipulation and fraud. I had a lot to do before Saturday night. I needed to call the rehabilitation center to check on my father's physical therapy schedule. I needed to call my divorce attorney to finalize the paperwork we had drafted. And I needed to make sure my navy blue professional suit was perfectly pressed for the weekend. Liam wanted a spectacle. Brenda wanted to play the victim in front of 50 wealthy witnesses. Savannah wanted to laugh at my working-class roots while spending my money. They were all going to get exactly what they asked for. The trap was fully set, the bait was taken, and all I had to do now was wait for the curtain to rise on Brenda's 60th birthday. The morning sunlight filtering through my windshield felt different today. It was Friday, the day after Liam delivered his arrogant ultimatum in our kitchen. He fully believed he had crushed my spirit. He demanded a public financial execution, entirely unaware that he had just handed me the match to burn down his entire fraudulent life. During my lunch hour, I stepped out of the corporate accounting firm where I spent my days analyzing complex tax codes. I walked 3 blocks down the bustling downtown street, ignoring the food trucks and coffee shops. I was not hungry. I was running on pure, focused adrenaline. My destination was a sleek, modern high-rise building that housed one of the most ruthless family law firms in the city of Chicago. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. I was there to see Jessica. Jessica is a top-tier divorce attorney who charges $800 an hour. She is a woman known in the legal community for dismantling entitled husbands and securing ironclad financial settlements. I had crossed paths with her professionally over the years when managing high-net-worth corporate clients. Today I was sitting in her waiting room as a wife seeking absolute liberation. Her office smelled of polished leather and fresh orchids. When her paralegal ushered me in, Jessica was sitting behind a massive glass desk. She wore a pristine white suit that made her look like a shark circling the water. She offered a warm, professional smile and asked how my father was doing. I told her he was safely settled in the rehabilitation facility. I explained he was making slow but steady progress and that his medical bills were no longer a concern. Then I placed my heavy leather tote bag on her desk. I told Jessica everything. I detailed the last 5 years of my marriage to Liam. I explained how I brought in a senior accountant's salary while he coasted on a mediocre middle management income. I explained how he insisted on controlling our joint savings under the guise of traditional household leadership. I recounted the terrible night in the hospital corridor when he refused to let me use a fraction of the money I had personally earned to save my father from permanent paralysis. Finally, I laid out the secret financial arrangement I had maintained for Brenda and Savannah. I described funneling nearly $200,000 into their luxury lifestyle to protect Liam's fragile pride. Jessica listened silently. Her sharp eyes studied my face. I unzipped my bag and handed her the master copy of the financial dossier I had constructed. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers turn the pages. I watched her read the printed emails from Brenda begging for rent money, while claiming she would be homeless if Liam ever found out. I watched her examine the bank statements proving that $98,000 of our joint savings came directly from my paychecks. As she absorbed the sheer volume of undeniable audited proof, her professional composure cracked into a bright, genuine laugh. She leaned back in her chair and told me that in 15 years of practicing family law, she had never seen a client walk through her doors with a case already dismantled, audited, and wrapped in a perfect bow. We spent the next 2 hours drafting a devastating divorce petition. Because Liam had foolishly threatened to secure an emergency injunction to freeze my assets, Jessica and I struck first. We filed for an immediate temporary restraining order on the joint savings account. This ensured Liam could not touch a single cent of the money I needed for my father's ongoing recovery. We outlined his financial coercion and attached the audited proof of my contributions. We built a legal fortress that his mother's country club friends could never breach. By the time I left her office, the trap was fully armed, waiting for a judge's signature first thing Monday morning. The legal battle was practically won before Liam even knew we were at war. But the social battle was scheduled for Saturday night. I returned to my accounting firm as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers. My colleagues were winding down for the weekend, packing their briefcases and making dinner plans. They were completely oblivious to the meticulous operation I was about to execute. I locked the door to my corner office and turned on the heavy-duty binding machine I had brought in specifically for this task. Liam wanted a public presentation. He wanted me to bring documents to the expensive downtown steakhouse and prove to his extended family that I was not a thief. I am nothing if not a professional who exceeds expectations. I was going to provide a financial autopsy so thorough it would leave them speechless. I loaded the high-quality, thick stock paper into the tray. I was printing exactly 15 copies of the master dossier. I wanted to ensure that every single significant guest at Brenda's 60th birthday dinner received their own personal packet of truth. I wanted his aunts, his uncles, and the judgmental church ladies to hold the undeniable facts in their own hands. As the printer hummed, churning out page after page, I allowed myself a rare moment of dark professional accountant humor. At the very front of each bound packet, directly behind the crisp title page, I inserted 2 large, brightly colored pie charts. Numbers can be confusing for people who do not read spreadsheets for a living, but visuals are universal. The first pie chart illustrated our household income over the last 5 years. A massive deep blue slice took up almost the entire circle, representing my $185,000 corporate salary. A tiny, pathetic sliver of pale yellow sat at the top, representing Liam's stagnant $62,000 income. The visual contrast instantly destroyed his entire narrative of being the dominant male provider. The second pie chart broke down the deposits into our joint savings account. It showed in vivid detail that my personal transfers accounted for nearly the entire balance. It proved Liam had contributed roughly the cost of a decent used car over half a decade. It was a mathematical execution. The subsequent pages formed a section I had cheerfully titled The Brenda Subsidy. I left absolutely nothing out. I highlighted every single rent payment I had quietly wired to her luxury high-rise apartment building. I attached the invoice for Savannah's designer vehicle lease, complete with the dealership signatures, proving I was the sole financial guarantor keeping her out of a sensible economy car. I printed the itemized credit card statements showing the $400 hair salon appointments, the $200 weekday brunches, and the expensive country club membership dues I had funded. I laid bare the absolute hypocrisy of women who sat around sipping mimosas and mocking my working-class father while entirely dependent on my working-class work ethic to survive. Every dollar they spent was a dollar I had earned. Every luxury they flaunted was built on my exhaustion. I made sure the documentation was flawless, leaving absolutely no room for interpretation or debate. The final section of the packet was the correspondence vault. I included the desperate, frantic emails Brenda had sent me over the years. I highlighted the exact paragraphs where she confessed her maxed-out credit cards and begged me to keep her financial ruin a total secret from Liam. I highlighted the sentences where she called me her saving grace and promised she would pay me back every single penny. It was a promise she never had any intention of keeping. These were her own words printed in crisp black ink, utterly destroying the vicious smear campaign she was currently running against me. They could not lie their way out of their own emails. I spent hours punching holes and threading the thick plastic spirals through the paper. I bound each packet with a sleek black cover. When I finally finished, I stacked the 15 dossiers on my desk. They formed a physical tower of irrefutable truth. The sheer weight of the folders in my hands was deeply intoxicating. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you hold the absolute truth in a room full of liars. I packed the heavy packets carefully into an oversized, reinforced leather briefcase, making sure the corners remained pristine. I left the office late that night, driving home to a quiet house. Liam was already asleep, dreaming of his impending victory, completely unaware that his nightmare was already printed and bound. Saturday evening arrived with a cool, sharp breeze rolling off Lake Michigan. The sky over the suburbs faded into a deep twilight blue as I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I did not dress like a broken, grieving wife crumbling under the pressure of her family's medical tragedy. I did not dress like a hysterical woman who had been caught embezzling funds. I dressed like a senior corporate executive walking into a hostile boardroom takeover. This was the most important presentation of my life. I slipped into a sharp, perfectly tailored navy blue dress that fell elegantly just below my knees. It was armor masquerading as evening wear. I clasped a simple string of pearls around my neck. It was a gift from my father on my college graduation day, a quiet reminder of exactly who I was fighting for. I pulled my dark hair back into a sleek, tight knot, ensuring not a single strand was out of place. I applied a fresh coat of bold red lipstick. I looked calm, powerful, and utterly untouched by the petty, toxic suburban drama Liam and his mother had tried to drown me in. Liam had left for the restaurant an hour earlier. He had stood in the hallway adjusting his expensive silk tie and told me he needed to greet the early arrivals to make sure the private dining room was set up to his exact specifications. He had sneered at me on his way out the door, his voice dripping with that same arrogant condescension. He reminded me not to be late and explicitly told me not to forget my little paperwork. He warned me that everyone was waiting to hear my pathetic excuses and that I had better be ready to beg for his mother's forgiveness. I had simply smiled at him and promised him I had everything I needed. He walked to his car with a confident stride, fully believing he had broken me. He believed I was spending my afternoon weeping and trying to figure out how to explain away my imaginary crimes. I walked out of the master bedroom and down the silent hallway. I picked up the large, reinforced leather briefcase containing the 15 bound dossiers. It was incredibly heavy, but I carried it with ease, fueled by the pure adrenaline pumping through my veins. I unzipped the front pocket and checked inside one last time. Nestled safely against the black plastic covers of the financial packets was a thick white envelope. It contained the freshly drafted divorce petition, complete with Jessica's official law firm letterhead and the signed temporary restraining order freezing our joint assets. Everything was perfectly in place. I was not just bringing a defense. I was bringing total annihilation. I had spent 5 years bending over backward to please a family that viewed me as a disposable resource. I had tolerated the snide comments, the financial drain, and the emotional neglect because I thought it was the right thing to do. That version of Clara was completely gone. I walked out of the empty house and locked the heavy wooden front door behind me. The crisp evening air washed over my face as I walked down the driveway to my 10-year-old sedan. I got into the driver's seat, placed the leather briefcase carefully on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The old motor purred reliably. I pulled out of the quiet suburban neighborhood, heading toward the glittering lights of the downtown skyline. The drive felt surreal. The city traffic moved around me in a blur of headlights and street lamps, but my focus remained absolute. Liam thought he had brilliantly cornered me into a public humiliation. He expected to break me in front of his entire family and all of his mother's wealthy friends. He was entirely unaware that he had just built the stage, funded the venue, and provided a captive audience for his own absolute destruction. He thought he was forcing a terrified mouse to confess to crimes she did not commit. He did not realize he had just invited a lion into a room full of fresh meat and handed her the microphone. I pressed my foot against the accelerator, driving through the city streets, heading directly to the steakhouse to serve justice. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room at the Wellington Steakhouse swung open to reveal a scene that could have been pulled straight from a cinematic portrayal of high society. The room was a sprawling, opulent cavern of dark mahogany-paneled walls, accented by glittering brass fixtures and massive crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the long, impeccably set tables. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided silently across the thick woven carpets, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. 50 people filled the room, their voices merging into a steady, arrogant hum of privileged conversation. I stood at the entrance for just a fraction of a second, letting the sheer magnitude of the gathering wash over me. My husband Liam had certainly not exaggerated the guest list. His entire extended family had flown in from across the country. I saw his uncles in their tailored suits, his aunts draped in expensive jewelry, and a flock of cousins who had always treated me with a polite but chilling distance. Clustered near the grand marble fireplace were the prominent members of the local church committee, including Patricia and Susan, the very women who had sat on the country club patio and maliciously gossiped about my father's tragic stroke. And holding court at the absolute center of it all, seated at the head of the main table like a reigning monarch accepting tribute, was Brenda. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown that I knew for a fact cost more than $2,000 because I had quietly paid the credit card bill for it 3 months ago. Her blonde hair was styled into an intricate, flawless updo, and she was laughing softly, placing a manicured hand over her chest as one of her wealthy socialite friends complimented her youthful appearance. She looked radiant, completely unbothered, and entirely convinced of her own untouchable status. Savannah sat immediately to her right, wearing a sleek black cocktail dress, casually swirling a martini glass. When Savannah caught sight of me standing in the doorway, her lips curled into a sharp, knowing smirk. She leaned over and whispered something into her mother's ear. Brenda looked up, locked eyes with me, and offered a tragically sad, incredibly fake smile of pity. I did not break eye contact. I did not shrink back. I adjusted the heavy leather briefcase hanging from my shoulder, smoothed the skirt of my crisp navy blue dress, and walked into the room with my head held high. Liam immediately intercepted me near the bar. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my skin with a forceful, controlling grip, and pulled me slightly away from the crowd. He smelled of expensive cologne and scotch. His face was set in a tight, furious mask of absolute authority. "You actually showed up," he whispered harshly, his breath hot against my cheek. "I was half expecting you to pack your bags and run back to your parents' cheap little house to hide." "Do you have the paperwork?" I demanded. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, then looked back up into his eyes. My expression was perfectly blank, offering him absolutely nothing to feed his ravenous ego. "I have everything you asked for, Liam," I replied, my voice cool and even. "Every single document." "Good," he sneered. Releasing my arm as if touching me disgusted him. He adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest. "Sit down, and keep your mouth shut until I tell you to speak. You are going to apologize to my mother in front of everyone for the stress you have caused her this week. Do not embarrass me, Clara." He turned his back on me and walked toward the head of the table to join his mother, completely blind to the fact that he had just sealed his own fate. The dinner service began, and it was 2 agonizing hours of pure theatrical torture. I sat near the middle of the long table, surrounded by distant relatives who refused to make eye contact with me. The gossip network had clearly done its job flawlessly. I could feel the hostile, judging stares burning into the side of my face as the waiters served courses of lobster bisque, dry-aged prime rib, and truffle asparagus. Every time I reached for my water glass, the conversation around me seemed to deliberately pause, dropping into hushed conspiratorial whispers. Down at the head of the table, Liam was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He ordered expensive bottles of wine for the table, waving his hand dismissively when the waiter presented the bill, acting the part of the incredibly successful, generous patriarch. Brenda dabbed at her eyes with a cloth napkin whenever someone asked how she was coping with the stress of the week, playing the role of the regal suffering martyr to absolute perfection. Savannah kept shooting me venomous, triumphant glares over the rim of her wine glass. They were all completely intoxicated by their own false narrative, utterly convinced that they had successfully backed me into a dark corner where I would be forced to surrender. I ate my steak slowly, chewing each bite with methodical precision. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel afraid. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of finality. The people in this room were celebrating a fortune built entirely on my exhaustion, my labor, and my sacrifices. They were toasting to a lifestyle that did not actually exist. As the waiters moved silently through the room, clearing the heavy dinner plates to make way for dessert, the ambient noise in the room began to shift. The low hum of conversation faded as Liam suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up. He reached forward, picked up his crystal champagne flute, and tapped it loudly with his silver dessert spoon. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the dining room. 50 faces instantly turned toward the head of the table. The waiters respectfully stepped back against the mahogany-paneled walls. The room fell completely silent. Liam stood tall, projecting a commanding, sorrowful presence. He looked out over his extended family, his mother's wealthy friends, and the judgmental women from the church committee. He smiled down at Brenda, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Family, friends, and esteemed guests." Liam began, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the 60th birthday of a truly remarkable woman. My mother Brenda has always been the moral center of this family. She has always taught us the value of honesty, integrity, and absolute loyalty." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Patricia and Susan nodded solemnly from their seats. Brenda cast her eyes downward in a display of practiced, humble modesty. However, Liam continued, his tone suddenly shifting from warm celebration to dark, heavy disappointment. "This week should have been a time of pure joy. Instead, it has been overshadowed by a profound and devastating betrayal of that very integrity my mother holds so dear." The silence in the room deepened into something thick and suffocating. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. 50 pairs of eyes darted nervously between Liam and Brenda, sensing the dramatic shift in the atmosphere. Savannah leaned back in her chair, a cruel, expectant smirk spreading across her face. Liam turned his gaze away from his mother and looked directly down the length of the table. He locked eyes with me. His face was a mask of cold, furious righteousness. "Marriage is supposed to be built on a foundation of absolute trust," Liam said, his voice rising in volume, ensuring every single person in the room could hear his accusations perfectly. "When two people build a life together, they pool their resources, they plan for the future, and they protect their hard-earned assets. But recently, I have uncovered some severe financial discrepancies in my own household." Gasps rippled through the dining room. A few of the older aunts clutched their pearls. The wealthy socialites leaned forward in their chairs, captivated by the sudden scandalous turn of events. My wife Clara, Liam continued pointing a stiff accusatory finger directly at me, has recently experienced a tragic medical emergency in her own family. Her father suffered a stroke. While my heart breaks for her family's misfortune, a medical crisis does not excuse criminal behavior. Instead of coming to me as a partner, Clara suffered a complete mental breakdown. She began hiding financial documents. She locked my mother out of our shared communication portals, and I have strong reason to believe she has been secretly embezzling money from our joint savings account to funnel to her destitute parents. The word embezzling hung in the air like a physical weight. The entire room collectively gasped. Brenda let out a loud theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands as if the pain of my supposed betrayal was simply too much to bear. Savannah patted her mother's back, glaring at me with undisguised hatred. Liam stood there basking in the shocked, horrified reactions of his audience. He believed he was delivering the ultimate crushing blow. He was painting me as a hysterical, financially abusive thief in front of everyone who mattered to his family's reputation. Clara Liam shouted, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I told you that you would not be allowed to ruin this family with your financial sabotage. I demanded that you bring a full, unredacted financial audit to this dinner tonight. I demand that you stand up right now, look my mother in the eye, and explain exactly where my money has gone. And if you refuse, or if you try to lie to these good people, our marriage is over, and I will freeze every single asset to my name by Monday morning. The silence that followed his ultimatum was absolute and terrifying. Every single person at that massive table turned to stare at me. They expected me to burst into frantic tears. They expected me to run crying from the room. They expected me to collapse under the crushing weight of public humiliation and beg for mercy. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not break eye contact with my husband. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored navy dress. I reached down and picked up the heavy reinforced leather briefcase resting by my feet. I hoisted it onto the polished wooden table with a loud, solid thud that made the crystal glasses rattle. Liam frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second as he stared at the massive leather bag. He had asked for bank statements, perhaps a few printed sheets of paper apologizing for my behavior. He had not expected a piece of heavy luggage. I unzipped the main compartment of the briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out the first thick black-bound dossier. I dropped it onto the table in front of Liam's Uncle Robert, who was sitting immediately to my left. Then I pulled out a second dossier and handed it to Patricia, the church gossip. I pulled out a third and slid it down the table toward Susan. I pulled out a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. The heavy plastic bound packets hit the table one after another with a rhythmic, devastating finality. "What is this?" Liam demanded, his voice losing its booming authority, replaced by a sudden creeping edge of uncertainty. "Clara, what are you handing out?" I ignored him entirely. I continued pulling the heavy, meticulously organized financial autopsies from my bag, passing them down both sides of the long table. The guests stared down at the thick black covers, completely bewildered by the sheer volume of documentation I was distributing. "You asked for a full financial audit, Liam," I finally said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent room. "You demanded that I prove exactly where the money in our household has been going for the past 4 years. I am a senior corporate tax accountant. I do not do things halfway." I pulled the final, thickest dossier from the bottom of the bag. I walked slowly down the length of the dining table, feeling the eyes of 50 people tracking my every movement. I stopped right next to Liam's chair. I looked down at his mother, who had stopped her fake crying and was now staring at the black packet in my hands with a look of dawning, absolute terror. I dropped the master dossier directly onto the table in front of Liam. "Go ahead, Liam," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Open it. Read the very first page aloud for your family. Show everyone the absolute truth about your money." Liam stared at the black cover. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. He looked at Savannah, who had suddenly gone completely rigid in her chair. He looked at Brenda, whose face was rapidly draining of all color, turning an ashen, sickly white. With trembling fingers, Liam reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover of the dossier. His eyes scanned the first page. It was the vividly colored pie chart backed by certified, unredacted bank statements and W-2 tax forms. It was the undeniable mathematical proof that I earned triple his salary. It was the concrete, audited evidence that $98,000 of the joint savings account he claimed to own had been deposited entirely by me, while his total contribution over 5 years was barely $12,000. I stood beside him and watched the exact moment his entire reality shattered. The arrogant, triumphant sneer that had defined his face for the last 3 days vanished instantly. His jaw went slack. The flush of angry color drained completely out of his cheeks, leaving his skin pale and clammy. His eyes widened in sheer absolute horror as his brain tried and failed to process the numbers staring back at him. He realized in front of 50 people that he was not the wealthy provider. He was the dependent, and I knew as I watched his hands begin to shake, holding the heavy paper, that he had not even reached the section containing his mother's begging emails. The true execution had only just begun. The heavy silence in the private dining room stretched out for what felt like an eternity. It was the kind of absolute suffocating quiet that only happens when a room full of arrogant people realizes they are standing on the edge of a massive cliff. I stood at the side of the long mahogany table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the back of my empty chair. I watched my husband's eyes frantically dart back and forth across the glossy, brightly colored pie charts on the first page of the dossier. The smug, victorious patriarch who had demanded my public execution just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified, hollow man watching his entire fabricated reality dissolve into thin air. I did not let the silence drag on long enough for anyone to formulate an excuse. I had the floor, and I was going to use it. "Please, everyone, turn to page 1. I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the length of the opulent room. It was my professional auditor voice, completely devoid of anger or hysteria. Around the table, 50 people instinctively obeyed. The crisp, simultaneous rustling of heavy stock paper echoed through the room like a sudden gust of wind. I watched Liam's Uncle Robert adjust his reading glasses. I saw Patricia, the haughty church gossip, lean in closely to examine the printed graphs. Liam stood up here tonight and accused me of financially abusing him. I continued pacing slowly down the side of the table so I could look his extended family directly in the eye. He accused me of embezzling from our joint savings to funnel money to my working-class parents. But as you can all clearly see on the first page of the document in front of you, the financial dynamics of our household are quite different from the fairy tale my husband likes to project. I paused, letting their eyes adjust to the numbers. For the past 5 years, Liam has earned a stagnant salary of $62,000, I announced, articulating each syllable with sharp precision. I, on the other hand, am a senior corporate tax accountant. My annual take-home pay is $185,000. I make exactly 3 times his salary. I have paid our mortgage, our utilities, and every vacation we have ever taken. A low collective murmur of shock rippled through the guests. Liam's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and spin the narrative, but no sound came out. His jaw simply worked up and down in silent panic. "If you look at the second chart on that same page," I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through the rising murmurs, "you will see a certified, audited breakdown of the joint savings account Liam claims I am stealing from. Over the last half-decade, that account has accrued $110,000. Exactly $98,000 of that total came directly from my personal paychecks. Liam has contributed a grand total of $12,000 in 5 years. I stopped walking and turned to face my husband, who was now gripping the edges of the table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "I am not stealing your money, Liam," I said, my tone dripping with absolute ice. "You have simply been claiming my wealth as your own personal achievement, playing the role of the generous provider while hoarding the money I earned." The wealthy socialites, sitting near the center of the table, exchanged wide-eyed, scandalous glances. The uncles who had previously looked at me with cold judgment were now staring at Liam with undeniable pity and embarrassment. But I was not even close to being finished. The destruction of Liam's ego was merely the opening act. The main event belonged to the woman sitting at the head of the table. Now, if you would all kindly turn to page 3, I instructed, shifting my gaze directly onto my mother-in-law. Brenda was gripping her crystal water goblet like a lifeline. Her face, usually so perfectly composed and powdered, had turned a sickly translucent shade of gray. She knew exactly what was on page 3. Page 3. Details a special financial category I like to call the Brenda Subsidy, I announced loudly, ensuring the women from her church committee heard every single word. Liam was very concerned about where my money was going. He was deeply offended that I wanted to use a fraction of my own savings to pay for my father's neurological rehabilitation after a massive stroke. He told me that my working-class parents were a burden who failed to plan for their future. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the head of the table. But for the past 48 consecutive months, I declared, my voice ringing off the mahogany walls, exactly $3,800 of my salary has been secretly wired out of my personal checking account to fund Brenda's lifestyle. Someone at the far end of the table actually dropped a silver fork. It hit a porcelain plate with a sharp, ringing clatter. Every single month for 4 years, I continued, my eyes locked onto Brenda's terrified face. I have paid the rent for her luxury downtown high-rise apartment. I have paid the monthly lease on the designer Mercedes SUV that Savannah drove to this restaurant tonight. I have paid the exorbitant membership dues for the Oak Ridge Country Club so Brenda could sit on the patio sipping champagne and laughing about my family's poverty with her friends. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Gasps erupted across the dining room. Patricia and Susan, the very women Brenda had desperately tried to impress, physically recoiled in their heavy wooden chairs. Their eyes were as wide as saucers, staring at Brenda, as if she had suddenly manifested a contagious disease. Savannah, sitting in her expensive black cocktail dress, shrank down into her seat, pulling her designer handbag off the table and hiding it in her lap. Brenda could not take it anymore. The polished, regal facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She lunged forward, slamming her hands flat onto the table, knocking over her water goblet. The ice and water spilled across the crisp white linen tablecloth, soaking into the fabric. "Clara, stop it right now!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "How dare you? This is a private family matter. You have absolutely no right to bring this up in front of my friends. You promised to keep this a secret." I did not flinch. I stood my ground, looking down at her frantic, desperate face with absolute revulsion. "You do not get to claim privacy now, Brenda." I shot back, my voice laced with a cold, righteous fury that silenced the entire room. "Your son stood up 10 minutes ago and demanded a public financial audit. He demanded that I empty my pockets and prove my innocence in front of 50 people to satisfy your vicious, lying smear campaign. You wanted a public reckoning. You demanded a spectacle. Well, you are getting one." I turned my attention away from Brenda and addressed the horrified guests, gesturing toward the thick black dossiers resting in front of them. "If you turn to the final section of your packets, you will find copies of the original correspondence I instructed." The sound of 50 people hastily turning pages filled the room. I watched their eyes scan the highlighted text. I had organized the emails chronologically, painting a perfect, undeniable portrait of Brenda's manipulation. "Read them," I commanded. "Read the emails where Brenda admits she has completely maxed out 6 different credit cards. Read the messages where she begs me, crying, to pay her rent because she is facing imminent eviction. Read the exact paragraphs where she pleads with me to keep her absolute financial ruin a secret from Liam, because knowing his mother is utterly broke would destroy his fragile pride. I watched the socialites from the country club read the words. I watched the physical transformation take place. In the world of high society, there is nothing more unforgivable than a fraud. The women who had fawned over Brenda's emerald gown just an hour earlier were now leaning away from her in utter disgust. The illusion of her old money status was dead, replaced by the pathetic reality of a grifter living off her daughter-in-law's charity. Liam was completely frozen. He was staring at the printed emails in his dossier, his eyes tracing his mother's frantic pleading words over and over again. His entire understanding of his family, of his marriage, and of his own authority was collapsing in real time. The mother he idolized as a paragon of upper-class virtue was a dependent. The wife he belittled as a working-class burden was the sole benefactor keeping them all out of poverty. Liam slowly lifted his head. He looked at Brenda. His face was a mask of sheer shattered disbelief. "Mom." Liam whispered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its former booming arrogance. "Mom, is this true? Have you been taking her money?" Brenda looked at her son and the last remnants of her pride vanished. She collapsed back into her heavy wooden chair. Ugly, real tears began to stream down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. Her chest heaved with heavy, desperate sobs. She looked utterly pathetic, a cornered animal realizing there was nowhere left to run. "We have nothing, Liam," Brenda wailed, burying her face in her trembling hands. The pension was not enough. The credit card interest kept piling up. I was drowning. We are completely broke. I just wanted to maintain our standard of living. I did not want you to be ashamed of me. Savannah put her head down on the table and began to cry, hiding her face in her arms. Liam stared at his mother, his mouth open, absolutely paralyzed by the magnitude of the deception. He looked at the pie charts. He looked at the bank statements. He looked at the ruin of his family's reputation playing out in front of his aunts, uncles, and family friends. He finally turned his gaze to me. For the first time in 5 years, there was no condescension in his eyes. There was no arrogance. There was only a desperate, pleading realization that he had made a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. He had driven away the only person holding his entire world together. "Clara," Liam stammered, reaching a trembling hand out across the table toward me. "Clara, I did not know. I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea she was doing this. We can fix this. We can sit down and talk about the hospital bills. We can use the joint account for your dad. Please, we are a family." I looked at his outstretched hand, and I felt nothing but a profound, liberating coldness. He was not apologizing because he loved me. He was apologizing because I held the power. He was begging because the golden goose was walking out the door, and he was suddenly staring down the barrel of supporting his bankrupt mother and sister on his mediocre logistics salary. "You do not get to play the victim, Liam," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of Brenda's sobbing. "You told me my father's stroke was a tragic burden caused by poor planning. You told me you would not sacrifice your assets for my working-class parents. You chose your money over my father's life." I reached into the front pocket of my heavy leather briefcase. My fingers found the thick, pristine white manila envelope waiting inside. I pulled it out, holding it up so the stark white paper contrasted sharply against the dark mahogany of the room. I did not hand it to him. I tossed it. The heavy envelope sailed through the air and landed squarely on the table, sliding to a stop directly over his open dossier, covering the brightly colored pie charts. "That is my official resignation as your family's personal automated teller machine," I announced, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute finality that echoed in the ears of every single guest. "And inside that envelope are your divorce papers, complete with a temporary restraining order freezing the joint account you love so much. The funds for my father's rehabilitation have already been transferred. You will not touch another dime of my money as long as you live." Liam stared at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake. His hands hovered over it, completely unwilling to touch the physical manifestation of his ruined marriage. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase on my shoulder. I stood up perfectly straight, looking down at the weeping, shattered remnants of the people who had tried to break me. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive anchor had finally been cut loose from my ankles. "Your mother," I said to Liam, repeating the exact cruel phrase he had used on me in the hospital corridor, "is your problem. You figure it out." I turned my back on the grand, opulent dining table. I did not look at the stunned church ladies. I did not look at the horrified aunts and uncles. I simply walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private room, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the polished marble floor of the restaurant. As I reached the exit and pushed the doors open, The silence in the dining room finally broke. It shattered into a chaotic, explosive symphony of screaming, arguing, and hysterical sobbing. I heard Liam yelling at his mother. I heard Patricia demanding answers. I heard the entire fake, luxurious world they had built completely tearing itself apart at the seams. I let the heavy door swing shut behind me, sealing the chaos inside the room. I walked out into the cool, fresh air of the Chicago night, completely free, ready to go back to the hospital and sit by my father's side. The drive home from the steakhouse was a blur of passing streetlights and cold Chicago wind. I had left Liam standing in the absolute ruins of his own arrogance. When Monday morning arrived, it brought the swift, brutal hammer of the legal system. The temporary restraining order that Jessica and I had meticulously filed hit the banking servers exactly when the downtown courthouse opened its doors. I remember sitting at my kitchen island drinking my dark roast coffee and refreshing my mobile banking application. The joint savings account, the massive pool of $110,000 that I had built with my own sweat and exhaustion, displayed a bright red frozen status. Liam was entirely locked out. He could not transfer a single penny to his mother. He could not withdraw a single dime to cover his own incoming legal fees. The digital vault was completely sealed shut, and I was the only person holding the combination. The profound sense of safety that washed over me in that quiet kitchen was indescribable. For 4 years, Brenda had floated on a soft, luxurious cushion woven entirely from my corporate salary. She had played the role of the refined old money matriarch to absolute perfection. She attended weekday brunches at the country club wearing expensive silk blouses and delicate pearl earrings. She hosted elegant dinner parties in her downtown high-rise apartment, pouring imported wine and bragging about her successful son. But the moment my monthly transfer of $3,800 stopped arriving, her glamorous world collapsed with terrifying speed. The upscale property management company that ran her luxury building did not care about her carefully cultivated social standing. They did not care about her tearful excuses or her frantic promises to pay later. Within 30 days of the steakhouse dinner, Brenda was handed a formal, non-negotiable eviction notice. The social fallout within her elite circle was merciless and absolute. High society is incredibly fragile, and it absolutely does not tolerate a fraud. The wealthy women from her church committee, the same women who had mocked my father's stroke, completely abandoned her. Patricia and Susan stopped answering her phone calls. They abruptly removed her name from the charity gala planning boards. Brenda was violently shoved out of the upper-class bubble and forced to pack her designer emerald gowns, her crystal glassware, and her imported perfumes into cheap cardboard moving boxes. With absolutely no savings and a destroyed credit score, she had to move into a tiny, poorly ventilated studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. There were no valet parking attendants or courteous doormen in her new neighborhood. There were no sweeping panoramic views of the Chicago skyline to admire from a private balcony. Instead, she had to listen to the constant, aggressive roar of highway traffic and the heavy metallic rattle of the elevated train cars passing by her single window. She had to learn how to carry her own heavy bags of discount groceries up 3 flights of narrow, dimly lit stairs. She was finally living the exact working-class reality she had spent her entire life despising and mocking. She had absolutely no one to blame but her own greedy, entitled reflection in the mirror. Savannah faced a similarly brutal awakening. Her pristine silver Mercedes SUV had always been the ultimate symbol of her unearned arrogance. It was the vehicle she used to drive to her expensive boutiques and exclusive hair salon appointments, all while sneering at people who actually worked for a living. She thought she was entirely untouchable. 2 weeks after the disastrous birthday dinner, a heavy-duty tow truck arrived in the middle of the night. The repossession agents hooked up the luxury vehicle and towed it right out of her apartment complex parking lot while her neighbors watched from their bedroom windows. Savannah woke up to an empty parking space and a crushing mountain of debt. Without my invisible financial net constantly catching her every fall, she was violently shoved into the harsh real world. With no marketable skills and no rich sister-in-law to blindly fund her delusions, She was forced to take a minimum wage job in retail just to survive. The woman who had proudly called my father a tragic burden was now forced to wake up at dawn and ride the early morning city bus to fold sweaters at a local shopping mall. She had to stand on her aching feet for 8 exhausting hours a day, dealing with rude, impatient customers and aggressive store managers. Her perfectly manicured hands became calloused and dry from hauling heavy cardboard boxes and scrubbing the store floors with harsh chemicals at closing time. It was a beautiful poetic justice to see her performing the exact same manual labor she had always believed was so incredibly far beneath her elevated status. While his mother and sister were drowning in the freezing depths of their new reality, Liam decided to launch one final desperate legal attack. He hired an aggressive attorney and demanded a formal mediation session. He genuinely believed his towering male ego could simply bully his way back into a position of absolute financial dominance. He walked into the grand mahogany-paneled conference room at the downtown mediation center, wearing his best-tailored charcoal suit. He was desperately trying to project the image of a wronged, highly successful patriarch who was simply reclaiming his rightful property. He sat across the long, polished wooden table from me and arrogantly demanded a massive alimony settlement. He claimed that he had grown accustomed to the affluent, comfortable lifestyle my senior accounting salary provided. He argued with a completely straight face that he was legally entitled to half of my corporate retirement funds, half of my private investment portfolios, and half of the equity in our suburban home. He completely ignored the massive glaring fact that his own family had been secretly draining our household resources for half a decade. He thought his aggressive posturing would be incredibly intimidating. He thought he could exhaust me into quietly surrendering my hard-earned assets just to make the nightmare go away. He completely forgot who was sitting directly next to me. Jessica did not even raise her voice. She simply opened her heavy leather briefcase and unleashed an absolute legal slaughter. She pulled out the exact same comprehensive financial dossier I had distributed at the steakhouse. She laid the brightly colored pie charts directly on the table in front of the court-appointed mediator. She calmly and methodically walked the mediator through the undeniable audited evidence of Liam's financial hoarding and his mother's systematic long-term extortion. She presented the desperate begging emails Brenda had written, confirming her massive credit card debt and her total financial reliance on my paychecks. She presented the certified bank logs proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that I had generated 98% of the joint savings account while single-handedly paying for every single piece of household overhead. Then Jessica played her absolute trump card. She produced a series of aggressive, insulting text messages Liam had sent me during the early days of our separation. In those messages, he explicitly bragged about refusing to pay for my father's medical care because he believed my working-class family was completely beneath his elite status. He had stupidly documented his own financial coercion in permanent, undeniable writing. The mediator was a stern, highly experienced former family court judge with absolutely zero tolerance for marital fraud or financial abuse. He looked at Liam with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The arrogant posture completely melted right off Liam's frame. He shrank down into his expensive leather chair, his face turning a sickly pale white as he realized he had absolutely no legal leg to stand on. His ridiculous demands for alimony were instantly laughed out of the room. His greedy attempts to claim my hard-earned savings were systematically dismantled and legally denied in their entirety. When the final divorce decree was stamped and formally signed, the victory was absolute and permanent. I walked away with 100% of my corporate retirement accounts. I retained sole ownership of my entire private investment portfolio. I was awarded the full financial equity of the suburban house we had shared, which I promptly listed on the real estate market and sold for a significant clean profit. Liam was legally granted exactly what he had actually contributed to our marriage, which amounted to a few meager thousands of dollars. He was left entirely alone carrying the heavy, crushing burden of having to financially support his bankrupt, evicted mother and his newly impoverished sister on his stagnant, mid-level logistics salary. He was chained forever to the very parasites he had fought so viciously to protect. I left the city and the toxic memories behind, buying a beautiful sunlit condominium much closer to the premium neurological rehabilitation center, where real genuine healing was actually taking place every single day. Months passed, turning the bitter cold winter into a bright, vibrant, blooming spring. I found myself sitting on a polished wooden bench in the lush green garden of the medical facility. The air smelled of fresh, damp soil and sweet blooming hydrangeas. The sky above was a brilliant, flawless blue, completely clear of any lingering storms or dark clouds. I watched the most beautiful, inspiring sight I had ever seen in my entire life. My father was walking. He was moving slowly, his brow furrowed in intense concentration, gripping a sturdy wooden cane with his left hand. A dedicated professional physical therapist walked closely beside him, offering quiet words of encouragement, but my dad was doing the incredibly hard work entirely on his own. His right leg, the leg the doctors feared might remain permanently paralyzed, stepped forward onto the paved garden path. His foot landed solidly against the warm stone. He took another step, then another, his chest heaving with the monumental effort of reclaiming his own independence and physical agency. He had spent 35 years walking through blinding winter snowstorms and blistering summer heat to deliver the mail, and he was using that exact same stubborn, unbreakable working-class grit to pull himself back from the absolute brink of tragedy. He did not complain about his circumstances. He did not demand pity from anyone around him. He simply put his head down and did the exhausting, painful, repetitive work required to survive and heal. Watching his incredible quiet resilience and comparing it to the fragile, lazy entitlement of my former in-laws filled my heart with a profound, overwhelming sense of pride and immense gratitude. My mother sat on the wooden bench right beside me. She looked a little tired, the lines around her gentle eyes slightly deeper than they had been a year ago, but the heavy, suffocating shadow of grief and terror had completely lifted from her face. She reached over and gently took my hand, lacing her warm, slightly calloused fingers through mine. She smiled a genuine, radiant smile, squeezing my hand tightly as we watched my father complete his lap around the beautiful, bubbling garden fountain. We did not need to speak to each other. The comfortable silence between us was incredibly peaceful, filled with the deep, unspoken understanding of a resilient family that had faced the absolute worst possible nightmare and come out the other side entirely unbroken. The massive medical deposit I had paid on the first of that terrible month had secured his spot in this incredible high-end facility, but his own brave, enduring heart had secured his miraculous recovery. I took a long, deep breath of the fragrant spring air and felt a profound, radiant sense of total personal liberation. I was a 31-year-old senior corporate tax accountant with a thriving, highly successful career trajectory. I was entirely financially secure, deeply loved, and surrounded by honest, hardworking people who valued me for exactly who I was, not for what I could buy them. I was completely free from the toxic, greedy leeches who had tried to drain my lifeblood to fund their glamorous, shallow illusions. I had burned their fraudulent empire completely to the ground, walked away from the scattered ashes, and built a beautifully authentic, peaceful life in its place. The heavy burden was finally gone forever, and the bright, limitless future belonged entirely to me. Boundaries aren't cruel, they are survival. Never set yourself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't offer you a blanket. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where and when you're watching. I'll see you in the next story.